So good morning, good afternoon, good whatever it is to Cert for Community Services at Belmont. Just introducing this next unit, promote Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander cultural safety, CHC DIV002. So the idea of cultural safety is important here, and I guess often when we're talking now about Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people, we can just use the term First Nations as well. So I just wanted to set the scene primarily in this first video, and I like to draw on experts. I guess I have to acknowledge first up, I'm not Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander person, but yeah, certainly if we want to do that acknowledgement, I can do an acknowledgement of country as an Aboriginal person, just saying, yeah, acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands, in my case here, of the Awabakal people from around Lake Macquarie, western Lake Macquarie at the moment, towards the Wadigan Mountains, as well, acknowledging that we're meeting on the now what we now know, the lands of the Awabakal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and Aboriginal people amongst us. And I can always, yeah, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And of course, an Aboriginal person, elder, a respected person, can do as opposed to an acknowledgement of country, can do a welcome to country. So just making that little differentiation up front. And as I guess, drawing on the experience and knowledge of others is really important in this unit, obviously, but I like to draw on music. It's been a big educator for me. As a young fellow, hear lyrics from certain songs, in particular in my case, Warumpi Band, Goanna. Warumpi was singing about things about the importance of land and culture, and singing in Indigenous language. It was a real eye-opener for me, and starting to question what was this all about. This for me, new knowledge I certainly wasn't getting in the classroom. Anyway, I guess when I introduced cultural diversity, and Bella will know this, and the others that were in that group obviously too, but I started with the lyrics from Archie Roach's song, Took the Children Away, which is around 30 years old now, certainly iconic, and that experience of his experience of what it was like to be one of the stolen generations. And, you know, when he first started performing that in Sydney, I believe, or Melbourne, wherever he performed those lyrics publicly, people would come to him and say, Archie, how did you know that story? And he'd say, no, that was my story. And I guess there was a realisation, hang on, that story or that experience of being removed was a common experience. So I've got a few of the lyrics, not the whole song, but if you get a chance to Google Archie Roach and Took the Children Away, please do so. I think that's a great starting point for anyone's journey if you haven't heard it. But where we're going to start now, something a little bit more, well, modern twist to an older song, another great song that educated me around the land rights movements, Paul Kelly and Kev Carmody's song From Little Things Big Things Grew. Here's a modern take on that by a Aboriginal fellow called Ziggy Ramo, and he is performing with Paul Kelly on ABC. I think it's called The Set. I think it might be the show that Dylan Alcott, the guy in the wheelchair, just won Wimbledon recently, maybe the day before or after Ash Barty. It's a great victory, and that was mentioned in class. Ash Barty, Indigenous woman, winning Wimbledon a couple of days ago now, and last time we had an Australian Australian woman win Wimbledon was Yvonne Goolagong-Cawley back in 1980. So certainly our Aboriginal Indigenous tennis players, certainly in the women, got an exceptional record for Australia, as do many Aboriginal people in the area of arts and sports and media and culture. And here's another example. Ziggy Ramo, I believe he comes from up near Bellingen, but here's a great song. Have a listen to this. And I guess what I asked the class to take out of this song, have a listen to the lyrics. It's a history lesson, and we went on to an activity after listening to this. But take a few notes as you listen to the lyrics, things that he mentions that you mightn't have been aware of. Certainly at the start, he talks about, around the 1500s, a decree, and I won't spoil it, but, I thought, I'd never heard that, and that sort of informs the whole idea that nations or other cultures can be invaded if they weren't viewed as Christian, based on a decree by a pope. Anyway, Ziggy mentions this, and he's accompanied by Paul Kelly, the original writer of From Little Things, but as I said, different take on it. So let's have a listen to this.
Gather round people and I'll tell you a story. 200 years of history that's falsified. British invaders that we remember as heroes. Are you ready to tell the other side? We started our story in 1493 with a piece of paper called the Doctrine of Discovery, invoked by Pope Alexander VI. Without this good Christian, our story don't exist.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Captain James Cook, he boarded a fleet, and he was armed with the Doctrine of Discovery. The same tactics were used by Columbus. It's how today Australia claims terra nullius. 'Cause on that paper, the Pope did write that you're only human if you've been saved by Christ. And if there are no Christians in sight, the land you stumble on becomes your God-given right.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Is that your Lord? 'Cause that's invasion. That's the destruction of 500 nations. That's the genocide of entire populations, which planted the seeds for the stolen generation and grew into my people's mass incarceration. Now we pass trauma through many generations, but the Lord can't discover what already existed. For 200 years, my people have resisted.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
The war's continued since Captain James Cook, and this side of history you don't write in your books. You don't want the truth, and you don't want to listen. But how can you stomach Australia's contradiction? 'Cause we went to war in 1945. We were allies against a terrible genocide. And I know it's uncomfortable, but the irony I see is that you fought for them, but you don't fight for me.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
We should move on. Move on to what? 'Cause I still remember. Have you forgot that Vincent Langari knew others were rising? Gurindji inspired us to keep on fighting. So call it Australia, go and call it what you like. I just call it how I see it, and I see genocide. Now that you hear me, can you understand? There can never be justice on our stolen land.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
This is the story of so-called Australia, but this is the story of so much more. How power and privilege cannot move my people. We know where we stand. We stand in our law.
From little things, big things grow. 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 From little things, big things grow.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Since 1991, 441 Indigenous Australians have died in custody. They're casualties of a war that never ended. But we are not yet defeated. Always was, always will be. Sovereignty was never ceded.
So there we go, pretty powerful song, or another powerful song from an Indigenous person, Ziggy Ramo, as I said, from up near Belgian Way, I believe, accompanied by Paul Kelly, writer, along with Kev Carmody of the original from Little Big Things, but another fine song, a history lesson. Hopefully you picked up a little bit of stuff along the way. He mentions towards the end, since 1991, 441 Aboriginal people have died in custody. And that's following on, there was an inquiry around 1988 to 1991 called the Inquiry into the Black Deaths in Custody, and made a lot of recommendations. However, yeah, have we addressed that issue? Certainly the evidence is no. And we had those big marches and protests last year, about a year ago. Actually, it was winter last year from memory. And oh yeah, looking at, again, putting that on the political agenda, the Aboriginal deaths in custody. He talks about the amount of nations and language groups, so 500 nations. So there's a map that I gave out, and there's a copy on the screen of kind of the allocation of in traditional Indigenous language groups or nations, so 500. I won't get into too much, but it just shows the diversity, if you like. You're talking about Indigenous diversity, a big country from one side to the other. Obviously similarities between groups, and interaction and trade and ceremony between groups. However, some differences as well, including language and, you know, traditional boundaries and land and things like that. Another thing that I'd like to mention, his last lyric was around sovereignty was never ceded, so meaning that Indigenous people by no way, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, never ever said to European invaders, have the land, you can take the land. There was no treaty, no discussion, so it was, you know, all actions, all invasion was based on that idea of terra nullius, that it was a vacant and empty land that nobody was using. And so I guess in a sense that Aboriginal people weren't considered human in that, from that perspective, if you will. So what I asked the class to do was to think about different time frames in Australia's journey. So I guess from breaking it up from pre-1788, so that was the first fleet arriving 1788, but, you know, if you had a bit of paper, pre-1788, what was it like? What was Australia like from an Indigenous perspective? What have you read? What do you know? What is your understanding? So jot down what you think, 1788. Then I broke it up into roughly 50-year increments, so I went 1800 to 1850. What do you know about Australia? What was going on? And again, particularly from that Indigenous perspective, what was happening for us Indigenous people from 1788? I must have went 1788 to 1850. So certainly that was that initial contact in Sydney primarily, and then up and down the coast and across around the country. I guess Newcastle followed on fairly soon as a penal settlement, early 1800s. Similarly, down in Tasmania and Port Arthur and up north of Newcastle, there's some penal settlements, penal activity going on, and then getting that spreading out into the across the Blue Mountains onto the farms or the plains of New South Wales. Anyway, so different perspectives of different people. 1850 went 1850 to 1900. So I don't expect you to be a history expert, but then we had, we think in 1900 to 1950 there was different sort of actions. So that was probably, you'd argue, the height of that removal policy going on in that area, right through to 1970, in fact. But what was going on for Aboriginal people from that 1850 to 1900s? What do you know? What have you read? What do we know locally? 1950. The next we looked at 1950 through to 2000. So what did people know? What did they come up with in that era? Then we had 2000 to current day sort of stuff. So in doing that activity, or what I asked people to think about was what they could, what were some of the political things that might have been going, the political decisions, political actions, laws at that particular era. So what was different in 1788, 1850 through to say 2000, 2010? What are the differences around laws? And that includes things like, when did Aboriginal people get the right to vote or be included as citizens? What was that era? It's in the 60s, I'll give you a hint, not the 1860s. And then what else? You think about cultural things, sports, music, as I said, music for me. So likewise, movies. What have we learnt through movies? What year did Rabbit-Proof Fence come out, and what era was it dealing with? It came out in the early 2000s, I believe, and it was certainly dealing with that early 1900s, maybe around the 1920s, and that was again around that removal and stolen generations. Actions or events, things like World War I, World War II, we certainly know now. Indigenous people went and fought for as alongside or with the European-based diggers, but were they given the same recognition and rewards upon coming back? Certainly things like land grants for returned soldiers after World War II, I believe. I don't think it was available to Indigenous or Aboriginal people, and I think Ziggy Rama even mentioned that in his lyrics. So, and also people thought about some of their local stories and history. We had some local knowledge around Swansea Heads and some of the carbon dating work around there, and what that showed about occupation, people that you might know in your local area, their stories, their connections, sites, localised books, arts, rock grooves, language, stories, things like that. Language and stories. We spoke about some of the schools singing the national anthem locally, or what we call language, and that was, we certainly knew about Windale, but it was also the experience of someone in the class. Their children were doing that at, I think it was Pelican Public School, from memory, so not far from Belmont. So think about all those things. If you want to take a moment to jot down what you know, and then you can pause that, do that, and then compare what we've come up with. If you want, there's a few, and some people did this in class, they had a bit of a Google. There's probably 7 or 8 different websites there that you might want to have a look at, one or two, just to give you a little bit of a hint if you're not too sure where to start. There's some timeline type of information at those websites from that Indigenous perspective. So I won't go through this totally word for word, and my apologies if I miss what some people might have said, and it's only because I can't actually see everything at the moment in terms of what was written, but certainly pre-1788. So what do we know? 60,000, 100,000, different theories there, how long Indigenous people had been here in Australia, certainly identified by many scholars or academics or researchers as the longest continuous culture in the world, meaning that it's unbroken, no changes, that the same sort of peoples and traditions and stories, interactions, music, celebrations, ceremony, organised law and roles going on for that amount of time. And I spoke about the carbon dating down at Lake Mungo in southwestern New South Wales, once a very fertile area, now pretty dry, but certainly evidence of remains of Mungo man and Mungo lady around that 50,000 year mark approximately. Just to give it some perspective, I think the pyramids were being 2,000 to 5,000 years ago roughly. So we're talking 50,000 plus years ago, that connection to this place. So, the idea that it was terra nullius, not farmed or used is obviously the 1788. The idea that you could stick a flag and say, yeah, we're here now, it's ours, based on a falsity. And there was evidence written. Writers like Bruce Pascoe talk about agriculture practices that were in place, things like yams, fish traps, eel farms, haystacks, things like haystacks out on the western plains of New South Wales once the Europeans crossed the mountain with their hard-hoofed animals. Native grasses was stacked up, like resembling a European haystack from the written records, and used for bread making, I guess you'd say, or an Indigenous bread. But that's not, I guess, from a European perspective. Did it resemble a farm in Europe? No, but was it farming? Definitely yes. And the Mabo case, which we talk about, that was if you might have mentioned Mabo, 1992. I guess Mabo was about up in the Torres Strait in particular, but there was evidence, of farming and use of land continuously unbroken. So that was able to overthrow the idea that terra nullius was false. But it was an organised society pre-1788, that most definitely. But with that idea of 500 language groups as well, we spoke about from 1788. So we've got things like small outbreaks of smallpox very quickly, and that this is in the Sydney area. It really impacted Aboriginal populations and peoples to the point that there was, written accounts that the Aboriginal people were dying at such a rate that they couldn't take care of their dead. There were bodies lying on the shores of Sydney Harbour. So it was devastating, and the idea that smallpox would spread between communities is quite feasible, and evidence that when Europeans met Aboriginal people, for example, in the upper reaches of the Hunter River, there was evidence that they had smallpox, but never ever having Europeans there. So the idea that it would spread through the Aboriginal community through their interactions is quite feasible. And certainly academics and scholars that look at the evidence that the British had a history of introducing smallpox to native groups, native peoples, as a way of dealing with them as a problem, if you like. And so there is a bit of evidence out there that was done in Sydney as well, although I guess there will be people who say, no, it didn't happen, but there are certainly people who say, yeah, that did happen. And there were a few major outbreaks of smallpox after 1788, or very soon after 1788. But then, we got violence and death and the guerrilla warfare we spoke about. Pemulwuy, a warrior in the Sydney region, almost brought the colony to its knees. So it wasn't about lying down and saying, you're here, we welcome you. Pemulwuy fought with his resistance fighters, guerrilla warfare, burning crops, etc. And almost, brought the colony to its knees, as I said. In the 1820s, locally, we had a European missionary called Threkeld, Lancelot Threkeld, popped up in Newcastle with the idea, he was funded to create missions to, I guess, Christianise the local peoples in our region, Newcastle, Lake Macquarie in particular. He set up a mission at Belmont, just across the road from where TAFE is, overlooking the lake. And he was only there for a few years and then moved his mission across to Toronto, where the Toronto Hotel stands now. And, he was sort of active from the mid-1820s through to mid-1840s doing that sort of work. And he worked closely with an Aboriginal local fella called Birraban. There's a school named after him at Toronto West. Birraban worked with Threkeld, and one thing they did was translate one of the Bibles into the Awabakal language. So there's this written records of Threkeld and Birraban's work that preserves that Awabakal or local in Lake Macquarie, Newcastle language that's used. And I guess that informs certain groups today that are keeping that language alive, and it would inform actions like keeping singing the national anthem in Awabakal. What else was going on in that era? Certainly massacres. So 1830s, we spoke about a Mile Creek massacre, well documented, up in the northern part of New South Wales, towards around the Tamworth region. Mile Creek was on a property owned by a local identity called Henry Dangar Park, named after him in Mayfield. Certainly a push in recent years. Aboriginal people suggesting that it's not appropriate to have that park named after a guy associated with the massacre of Aboriginal Indigenous people up at Mile Creek. I believe it was his station workers that were involved in the massacre of women, children, older people who were camped doing their traditional life. somewhere in the vicinity of whatever the name of his property was around that Mile Creek region. I guess why Mile Creek was, I guess, noted is that the perpetrators of the crime were brought to justice in the court, the European court, if you like, and were sentenced to death in many cases, I believe. But yeah, as I said, hard-hooved animals causing impact to traditional farming methods, whether they be native grasses or yams or things like that, soon trampled things and, yeah, really impacted on localised or Indigenous food sources, medicines, things like that. There was an Australian cricket team, first Australian cricket team of all Aboriginal men, 1868, I believe, there. Aboriginal people becoming more of, fringe dwellers on the edge of towns. In that era, we were probably getting the early incarnation of things called Aboriginal protection boards, which in state by state were the overseer of that removal of children policy. But I've certainly heard stories from Aboriginal lecturers when I was at uni about young children being sent to school, Aboriginal children sent to school, certainly in that era when schools started to pop up in our communities around Newcastle, as even an example. So Aboriginal kids, off they went to school and they were doing quite well. But there were certain measures put in place then called clean, clad and courteous laws that, there'd only had to be one complaint from a European or non-Aboriginal family and those kids could be asked to leave school. But initially, certainly they were my understanding, starting to participate in school and do quite well. I'll just sort of spin through this a bit quicker, but yeah, so that's that 1850 to 1900. Segregation, I guess, I spoke about being, that fringe dweller, but the idea of segregating Aboriginal people from the towns, but maybe they're working on properties, rural work, domestic work even, but certainly would be unpaid or primarily maybe just for provisions or rations, that sort of thing. Maybe a little bit of pay, but certainly I would argue you underpaid. So then we move into that 1900 to 1950 sort of period. So within there we've got the two world wars, World War One and World War Two. So we know Indigenous people fought in those wars. And as I said earlier, that didn't really get the recognition once returning, things like being granted land or being able to drink at the pub with their digger mates, as Stan Grant says in one of his great speeches. So there's something to look at, the Stan Grant speech. Have a Google for that. Sort of that era of the 1920s, I believe, the rabbit-proof fence that would be set, and that again was, I mentioned earlier, was about the removal policy of children and put into training schools, if you like, and that I guess from that period they were in pretty much full swing. That those protection boards, state-run protection boards, using organisations like the police or welfare boards to remove those children and place them in institutions in lots of cases, like as I mentioned earlier, Parramatta Girls' Home or Cootamundra Girls' Home, training schools or whatever they were, called to train Aboriginal girls to be domestics. As I mentioned, boys trained in missions like Kinchela to be farm workers or similar. Obviously, mistreatment, abuse, neglect, all that sort of stuff was part of that experience, and as well as breaking up the culture, the family. But it was, I guess, seen as approached from a government perspective, how to deal with the black problem. Things like Aboriginal people needing, if you wanted to move around freely, you would often need a thing called a ticket or a pass, I think, or maybe it was like a dog tag, might have been, I heard Aboriginal people explain it like that, but if you didn't have that, you could be thrown in jail if asked, perhaps by the police, if you're in town, where's your pass? No pass, in jail sort of thing. So there's a lot of that idea of segregation in that era, and, those shanty towns or missions set up or establishments on the fringes. I guess Kurua we spoke about as an example of one of those sort of places on the fringes of society set aside for Aboriginal people as a way of dealing with a problem. So 1950s to 2000, we started to get a lot more activism. So we had the Wave Hill Walk-Off up in the 60s. So this was sort of the precursor that really initiated the land rights movement. And Paul Kelly's original song from Little Things, Big Things Grow talks about that walk-off, Vincent Lingari walk-off and negotiation with politicians, which led to that symbolic handing over of land. And so we had things like freedom rides in the 60s. So Charles Perkins led a group of Aboriginal people, students, through Western New South Wales in particular, places like Moree, and they were refused entry to the Moree swimming pool based on their being Aboriginal. So they sort of got some media attention, and this was all around a time when there was things like referendums to, should Aboriginal people be considered full citizenship, and that was overwhelming, voted yes, and then getting the vote as well, having the right to vote granted all in the mid 60s. Things like the inquiries into the Aboriginal deaths in custody, 88, 89, 90, around that area. I think the report may have come out in 91. Finished. It took a few years, I think, to come together, but again, and as Ziggy Ramo and Paul Kelly, then their song, they talked about 441 Aboriginal deaths in custody since that report to the current day. So, other things we spoke about, I guess, from that political perspective, is the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. Again, is about that land rights and rights in general of Aboriginal people. And 1970 is roughly around the end of the removal of children policy, so that's pretty recent. We've got 1985, Ayers Rock handed back and became, traditional owners, big Uluru. We've got 2000 Olympics, Kathy Freeman winning there. And so this is a few. We're just, it's such a big history that we can only touch on a little bit. 2000s, I remember writing down that we had certainly a wave of really powerful Indigenous stories on the big screen, Rabbit Proof Fence, The Tracker, more of a mini-series called Redfern Now, all, Aboriginal produced and starred, and 10 Canoes comes to mind. There's many, many more. And we've got NITV created, National Indigenous Television, 2017 Uluru Statement of the Heart I mentioned. We've got 2007 Apology from Kevin Rudd. Okay, that little map there was just sort of the idea of Mabo, the Mabo Decision, which, as I said, was in the early 90s. Overrides the idea of terra nullius, but what was that all about? So that was, Adi Mabo was a Torres Strait Islander, although he didn't always live there. He spent a lot of time in Queensland. He certainly had some political nous, but the Torres Strait is a bunch of islands, quite a number of islands, biggest one being TI, Thursday Island, in between the tip of Australia up there and Cape York and Papua New Guinea, the PNG. Eddie Mabo was from an island called Mer, I believe. I think that's the spelling, MER. But again, he was able to show in the courts of law how his family had farmed the land. There were markers and traditions, and that was handed down from generation to generation to show, in fact, that the land was not empty and barren and terra nullius. It was productively used, yams, bananas, things like that. And so that was why that is a very significant moment. All right, let's have a look there. Cultural safety. There's a couple of questions. So question 1, describe the concept of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural safety. So there's a little slide, but to me, cultural safety is really about being safe in the workplace. And when I say safe, it's about being able to express yourself, who you are, your cultural identity, maybe your cultural practices, without fear of being ridiculed, putting yourself at disadvantage, excluded, negative attitudes put on you. So cultural safety is a place where anyone can express their cultural ideas without fear of retribution. Question 2, describe how cultural safety is related to cultural awareness. So what is cultural awareness? So cultural awareness is knowledge of other cultures, the influences, but also its importance about your understanding your cultural background, but that means including the biases. And we did speak about in class, and hopefully I've spoken about it in my previous video, but the idea that, we're indoctrinated into a society that may create biases, and generally will create some sort of bias. And I spoke about me and my experiences of roles for males and females as I give a gender bias. You hear jokes about certain groups, perhaps the LGBTQIA plus groups, hearing those sort of groups, hearing those sort of jokes or the negative comments, does that give you a sort of biased view of the world? And so if you being aware of these biases and, getting an understanding that they're based on the negative stereotypes, if you like, putting a negative to a whole group of people, understanding that and being able to address and work with that. And then, once you're getting an understanding of, people first, difference doesn't equal something terrible, bad or catastrophic, or it's not a threat to me or anybody else. Difference is to be celebrated in a cultural and human sense. So how does that cultural safety, how is it related to cultural awareness? So I guess having an awareness of who I am, what are my cultural beliefs, what are my backgrounds, what are my biases, does that help me understand what it's like to create a culturally safe workplace? So what do we need? How do we show this is a culturally safe workplace? Is it about, flags, information, different languages, different practices? Is it about acknowledgement of country? And the last one, describe how cultural safety is related to cultural competence. So cultural competence is the knowledge and understanding of other cultures, but not imposing your own views, listening, learning, communicating effectively across cultures. So listening and understanding and not imposing a particular barrow or view. You should do this. Remember I spoke about no shoulds. It's listening and learning, acknowledging perhaps where you don't know and seeking out where you can learn. Cultural competence from the perspective of Daniel Jack, a little slide that I have. So employing Aboriginal people. Daniel Jack's a worker at TAFE, involved in our Reconciliation Action Plan, RAP, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But strategies and policies about inclusion. So it's written in that you employ Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people have a role and this is what their role is. There's cultural awareness training, celebrating events like NAIDOC, which we do have, targeted courses that promote Aboriginal culture and history. Yes, TAFE's had a good history there, I believe. Use of language, I guess understanding some of the, talking about Aboriginal English there, and that's important, I guess, in terms of communication, understanding the perhaps different uses of words, deadly as an example, from an Indigenous perspective, the way that might be used. Aboriginal English. Branding and imagery, so little statements on emails and things like that about acknowledging the traditional owners and acknowledging country we've spoken about as part of general practice. So last slide, cultural competence is characterised by acceptance of and respect of difference, continuing self-assessment regarding culture, careful attention to the dynamics of differences and continuous expansion of cultural knowledge and resources. So again, that's that self-examination. What do I know? What don't I know? What's my misinformation? Where do I get the good information? What do I do with those negative statements that might be thrown around? Little statement at the end there about cultural proficiency. Okay, so there we have the first short answers looked at. I might leave it there. We've been going a while, so I'll say toodle pips.